She said, "Don't look there." Yet the rancher kept staring. What happened next enraged the whole town. The small town of Dusty Creek woke up slowly under the warm morning sun. Light wind moved across the dry fields, carrying dust through the quiet streets. Wooden buildings stood along the main road, and a few shop owners had just begun opening their doors for the day. Outside the town, a rancher named Ethan Cole guided his horses along a narrow dirt trail. Ethan was known by many people in Dusty Creek. He was a calm and hard-working man who lived alone on a modest ranch a few miles away from town. Every week, he rode into town to buy supplies and check on a few things. This morning looked normal, just like many others. Ethan tipped his hat slightly as he rode to the edge of town. His brown horse, Ranger, moved at a steady and relaxed pace. The quiet sound of hooves hitting the dirt road echoed through the peaceful morning. As he passed the blacksmith shop, old Mr. Harris waved at him. "Morning." "Ethan," the blacksmith called out. "Morning." Ethan replied with a small nod. Everything felt ordinary. But a few minutes later, something unusual happened. Near the center of town stood an old stone well. Many years ago, the well had been used by the entire town, but now it was rarely touched. A newer water pump had been built nearby, and the well had slowly become just another old part of Dusty Creek's history. Ethan slowed Ranger as he approached the well. That was when he noticed a woman standing there. She looked nervous. The woman wore a light blue dress covered by a dusty shawl. Her hands were tightly folded together, and she kept looking over her shoulder toward a large weathered barn across the street. Ethan gently pulled on the reins and stopped his horse. "Ma'am, everything all right?" he asked kindly. The woman looked up quickly, almost startled. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped closer to Ethan and spoke in a low, worried voice. "Please, don't look over there." Ethan blinked in confusion. "Excuse me," he said. The woman shook her head quickly, her eyes filled with concern. "Just trust me," she said quietly. "Don't look toward that barn." Ethan glanced at the direction she had mentioned without fully turning his head. It was the old red barn near the edge of town. The building had been there for decades. Farmers sometimes used it for storage, but most days it looked empty. Nothing about it seemed strange, at least not at first. Ethan looked back at the woman. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The woman hesitated again. She looked as if she wanted to explain something, but fear held her back. "I shouldn't have said anything," she whispered. Then she stepped back quickly. Ethan watched her carefully. Her nervous behavior only made him more curious. Why would someone warn him not to look at a barn? Ranger shifted slightly beneath him as Ethan sat quietly in the saddle. He had spent many years working on ranches and traveling across the frontier. Over time, he had learned something important. When people acted nervous for no clear reason, there was usually a story behind it. And Ethan had always been the type of man who wanted to understand the truth. Across the street, the old barn stood silent under the morning sun. For a few seconds, Ethan simply stared ahead, thinking. The woman slowly walked away toward the general store, but she kept glancing back at him as if hoping he would follow her warning. But Ethan did not move. Instead, curiosity slowly pulled his attention toward the barn. He finally turned his head. From where he sat, the barn door was slightly open. Shadows covered most of the inside, making it difficult to see what was happening there. But then Ethan noticed something. Movement. 2 men were standing near the entrance of the barn. They looked around carefully before carrying a wooden crate inside. The crate looked heavy, and both men worked together to lift it. Ethan narrowed his eyes. He recognized one of the men. It was Mr. Dalton, a member of the town council. Dalton was known as a serious man who often handled town business and meetings. Seeing him quietly moving crates into an old barn early in the morning felt unusual. Ethan leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Another man stepped out of the barn and spoke to Dalton, though their voices were too low for Ethan to hear. The second man quickly looked around the street, as if checking whether anyone was watching. For a brief moment, their eyes met Ethan's. Both men froze. The silence in the street suddenly felt heavy. Dalton straightened his coat and forced a small smile. Then he walked toward Ethan. "Well, good morning there, Ethan," Dalton said calmly. Ethan tipped his hat again. "Morning." he replied. Dalton stopped near the horse and folded his hands behind his back. Just taking care of a few town matters, Dalton explained casually. Ethan glanced once more toward the barn. Looks like early work, he said. Dalton chuckled softly. Yes. Well, sometimes town business must be handled quietly. Ethan noticed that Dalton's smile did not quite reach his eyes. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind pushed dust across the street, and the barn door creaked slightly. Finally, Dalton cleared his throat. No need to worry about what's going on over there, he said. Ethan studied the councilman's face. I wasn't worried, Ethan answered. Dalton nodded quickly. Good, good. Then Dalton turned back toward the barn. Ethan watched him walk away, his mind slowly filling with questions. Across the street, the barn door opened again, and another crate was carried inside. Whatever was happening there, it clearly wasn't something the town wanted people to notice. And suddenly Ethan remembered the woman's warning. Don't look over there. But now that he had looked, the rest of the morning in Dusty Creek felt different to Ethan Cole. He rode slowly through the town street, but his mind stayed on the old red barn. The image of the crates being carried inside kept returning to him again and again. Normally, Ethan would stop at the general store first, but today he continued riding for a moment, thinking carefully about what he had seen. Something about the situation did not feel right. Mr. Dalton was an important member of the town council. If he was moving supplies, there should be nothing secret about it. Town business was usually done openly. People in Dusty Creek trusted each other, and there was rarely a reason for hidden work. Yet the way Dalton and the other men had looked around made Ethan uneasy. Finally, Ethan guided Ranger toward the general store and tied the horse to the wooden rail outside. Inside the store, the smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Shelves were packed with tools, canned food, rope, and other supplies that ranchers needed. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Green, the store owner. She greeted Ethan with her usual friendly smile. Good morning, Ethan, she said. You're a little early today. Ethan nodded politely. Morning, Mrs. Green. He picked up a small basket and began gathering the items he needed, flour, coffee beans, and a few other supplies for the ranch. But while he moved through the aisles, he noticed something. 2 townsmen near the front window were speaking quietly. Their voices were low, but Ethan could hear a few words. The barn, early this morning, council business. Ethan pretended to look at a shelf while listening carefully. One of the men sighed. I just don't understand why it has to be done like this, the man said. The second man shook his head. Best not to ask too many questions, he replied. The conversation ended quickly when they noticed Ethan nearby. They suddenly became quiet and walked toward the door, leaving the store. Ethan placed the last item into his basket and walked to the counter. Mrs. Green rang up the supplies, while Ethan watched the street through the window. The barn was not visible from there, but he could still feel that something unusual was happening in town. Everything all right? Mrs. Green asked kindly. Ethan looked back at her. Did you see anything strange this morning? He asked. Mrs. Green paused for a second. Strange, she repeated. Ethan nodded. Over by the old barn. Mrs. Green's friendly expression faded slightly. Oh, that, she said quietly. Ethan leaned forward a little. You know about it? Mrs. Green glanced toward the door before answering. Well, she said slowly, Mr. Dalton told a few of us that the council is handling some supplies for town. What kind of supplies? Ethan asked. Mrs. Green shrugged. He didn't say exactly, just that it's better if people don't interfere. Ethan thanked her and paid for his items, but the answer did not satisfy him. When Ethan stepped outside, the sun was higher in the sky, and more people had begun moving through the town. A wagon rolled past. 2 children ran across the street laughing. A farmer carried sacks of grain toward the mill. Everything looked normal again. Yet Ethan could not ignore the feeling that the barn held some kind of secret. As he tied the supply bag onto Ranger's saddle, he noticed the same nervous woman from earlier standing near the corner of the street. She was watching him carefully. When their eyes met, she hesitated before walking toward him. I hoped you wouldn't stay, she said softly. Ethan tilted his head. You were the one who told me not to look, he replied. The woman nodded slowly. Yes. Why? Ethan asked. She looked around to make sure no one was listening. I work for the council office sometimes, she explained. Cleaning, organizing papers, things like that. And the barn? Ethan asked. Her voice dropped even lower. They brought something into town last night. Ethan crossed his arms thoughtfully. What kind of something? The woman shook her head. I don't know exactly, but I heard them talking. They didn't want people asking questions. Ethan studied her face. Then why warn me? The woman looked down at the ground. Because you're known for speaking honestly, she said. And I was afraid that if you saw what was happening, you might get pulled into trouble. Ethan smiled slightly. I already saw it. The woman looked worried again. That's what I was afraid of. At that moment, a loud voice came from across the street. Ethan! Both of them turned. Mr. Dalton stood near the barn, waving for Ethan to come over. The woman stepped back immediately. You should go, she whispered quickly. Just be careful what you say. Then she walked away quickly, disappearing between the buildings. Ethan took a deep breath before guiding Ranger across the street. Dalton waited near the barn door with two other men standing behind him. When Ethan approached, Dalton forced another polite smile. I see you're still in town, Dalton said. Just picking up supplies, Ethan replied calmly. Dalton nodded. Well, I wanted to speak with you for a moment. Ethan remained relaxed in the saddle. What about? Dalton glanced toward the barn. You noticed some activity here earlier, he said. Ethan said nothing. Dalton continued. There's no need to concern yourself with it. The other men shifted uncomfortably behind him. This is simply town storage, Dalton explained. Ethan looked at the half-open barn door. Inside, several more crates were stacked against the wall. Seems like a lot of storage, Ethan said. Dalton's smile tightened slightly. Town matters sometimes require privacy. Ethan thought about the woman's warning and the quiet conversations he had heard in the store. Whatever was inside those crates clearly mattered more than Dalton wanted to admit. By the afternoon, Dusty Creek was no longer as quiet as it had been in the morning. People moved through the streets as usual, but small groups had started forming near the shops and along the wooden sidewalks. Some spoke in low voices. Others simply watched the old red barn from a distance. Ethan Cole noticed the change right away. After finishing his business in town, he could have returned to his ranch. The trail home waited just beyond the town gate. But something inside him said that leaving now would feel wrong. So he stayed. Ethan tied Ranger near the water pump and walked slowly through the main street. As he passed the barber shop, he heard two ranchers talking. Did you hear about the barn? One of them asked. The other nodded. Everyone's talking about it now. Ethan paused near the porch railing, pretending to adjust his gloves while listening. They brought in a lot of crates last night. The first rancher continued. More than I've ever seen. But why keep it secret? The second man asked. That's what people want to know. Ethan continued walking, his thoughts growing heavier. By now it was clear that the barn was not just his concern. The entire town had begun noticing something strange. A few minutes later, Ethan stepped into the town cafe, a small place where many townspeople gathered in the afternoon. Inside, several tables were full. Coffee cups clinked softly while quiet conversations filled the room. When Ethan entered, a few people looked up at him. One of them was Tom Walker, a friendly farmer who had known Ethan for years. Tom waved him over. Ethan, come sit. Ethan pulled out a chair and joined the table. Tom leaned forward slightly. Word is you were near the barn this morning, he said. Ethan nodded once. I was passing by. Tom lowered his voice. Did you see anything? Ethan thought carefully before answering. I saw some crates being carried inside, he said, and Mr. Dalton seemed eager for people not to pay attention. Tom frowned. That doesn't sound like normal town business. Another man at the table spoke up. My brother helped unload the wagon last night, he said quietly. Everyone turned toward him. What wagon? Tom asked. A big supply wagon, the man replied. It arrived late after dark. And what was in it? Ethan asked. The man shook his head. They didn't open the crates. Dalton told them to carry everything straight into the barn. The cafe grew even quieter. People at nearby tables had begun listening too. Ethan noticed something important then. The townspeople were not angry yet, but they were confused. Dusty Creek had always been a place where neighbors trusted each other. Secrets like this made people uneasy. Tom rubbed his chin. "Maybe we should ask the council directly," he said. Several people nodded. "That seems fair," someone added. Just then the cafe door opened. The same nervous woman from earlier stepped inside. Her eyes searched the room until they found Ethan. She walked toward the table quickly. "Ethan," she said softly. He stood up slightly. "What is it?" The woman looked around to make sure no one from the council was nearby. "I heard something important," she said. Everyone at the table leaned closer. "This morning," she continued, "Mr. Dalton visited the council office." "And?" Ethan asked. "I heard him speaking with another council member," she said. "They were worried people might start asking questions." Tom crossed his arms. "That means they know the town is noticing." The woman nodded. "And they said the crates must stay in the barn until the meeting tonight." "Meeting?" Ethan asked. "Yes," she replied. "A council meeting." The table fell silent again. Tom finally spoke. "Then tonight is our chance." Ethan looked at the people around him. Every face showed the same feeling. They simply wanted the truth. Ethan stood up slowly. "If there's a meeting tonight," he said, "then the town should be there." Tom nodded firmly. "You're right." Word spread quickly through Dusty Creek. By evening, people had gathered near the town hall, a simple wooden building where council meetings were held. Lanterns lit the porch as the sun began to set behind the distant hills. Families, farmers, shop owners, and ranchers stood together outside. They were not shouting. They were not causing trouble. They were simply waiting. Inside the hall, the town council had already taken their seats. Mr. Dalton sat at the center table. When he looked out the window and saw the crowd forming outside, his confident expression slowly faded. Back outside, Ethan stood near the front of the group. Tom Walker stood beside him. "So what happens now?" Tom asked quietly. Ethan watched the lantern light flicker against the town hall walls. "Now," Ethan said calmly, "we listen." Moments later, the large wooden doors opened. A council assistant stepped outside. "The meeting will begin shortly," he announced. The townspeople began moving inside. Chairs filled quickly as everyone waited for answers. Ethan took a seat near the front. Across the room, Mr. Dalton looked uneasy for the first time all day, because now the secret that had started in the quiet morning near the old barn had reached the entire town. And in a place like Dusty Creek, once people started asking honest questions, the town hall of Dusty Creek was filled that evening. Lanterns hung along the wooden walls, casting warm light across the room. Chairs were packed close together, and many people had to stand along the back wall. Farmers, shopkeepers, ranchers, and families had all come to hear what the council had to say. At the front of the room sat the town council members behind a long wooden table. Mr. Dalton sat in the middle. For the first time that day, he looked uncomfortable. The quiet murmur of the crowd slowly faded when the meeting began. One of the council members stood up and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said. "We understand that many of you have questions." Several people nodded. Dusty Creek was normally a peaceful place, but today curiosity had spread through the town like a strong wind. Ethan Cole sat near the front beside Tom Walker. Both men watched the council table carefully. Mr. Dalton finally stood up. He placed both hands on the table and looked out at the room. "As you all know," Dalton began, "the town council sometimes manages supplies for the community." A few people shifted in their chairs. Dalton continued speaking. "This morning, some residents noticed activity near the old barn. I want to assure everyone that there is nothing dangerous or harmful involved." His voice was calm, but many people still looked uncertain. From the back of the room, someone spoke. "Then why keep it secret?" The question caused quiet agreement throughout the hall. Dalton paused for a moment. Ethan noticed the council members glance at each other. Finally, Dalton sighed. "It was not meant to be a secret," he said slowly. "But perhaps we should explain everything clearly." The room became completely silent. Dalton continued. "Several weeks ago, the council learned that nearby towns were running low on grain supplies. A long, dry season had affected farms in the area. Many people in Dusty Creek already knew about the dry weather, But Dalton continued with something new. A trading company from the north offered to buy large amounts of grain in the coming weeks, he said. They were willing to pay a much higher price than normal. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Tom leaned closer to Ethan. That explains the crates, he whispered. Dalton kept speaking. The council decided to store the town's extra grain in the old barn temporarily. The plan was to sell it later and use the extra money for town improvements. Some people nodded slowly, but others looked uneasy. A farmer near the front stood up. But that grain belongs to the town, the farmer said. It's our emergency supply. Dalton looked down for a moment. Yes, he admitted. That is true. Another voice came from the side of the room. What if the dry season continues here too? The person asked. We might need that grain ourselves. More people began nodding now. The idea of selling the town's safety supply did not sit well with many residents. Ethan remained quiet, listening carefully. Dalton rubbed his hands together. We believe it was a good opportunity for Dusty Creek, he said. The extra money could help repair roads, improve the school, and build a new water system. Those ideas sounded helpful, but the townspeople were thinking about something else. Tom stood up slowly. Why not tell the town first? He asked calmly. The question hung in the air. Dalton looked around the room at the many faces watching him. We thought it would be easier to organize the plan first, he admitted, then explain it later. A few people shook their heads. Dusty Creek had always been a place where decisions were shared openly. Keeping such an important plan quiet made people feel uneasy. At that moment, Ethan finally stood up. The room grew quiet again. Ethan was known as a fair and thoughtful man, and many people respected his opinion. He spoke calmly. No one here is against improving the town, Ethan said. Several people nodded. But the grain belongs to everyone, he continued, and decisions about it should include everyone too. Dalton listened carefully. Ethan was not angry. His voice remained steady and respectful. The town should talk about it together, Ethan said. That way the choice belongs to the whole community. For a moment Dalton said nothing. Then he slowly nodded. You're right, he admitted. The tension in the room softened slightly. Dalton looked out at the townspeople again. We should have asked the town first, he said honestly. That was our mistake. The other council members agreed. After a short discussion, the council made a new decision. The crates of grain would remain in public storage, and the town would vote together before making any plans about selling them. The crowd relaxed. People were satisfied that their voices would now be part of the decision. The meeting slowly came to an end. As the townspeople stepped outside into the cool evening air, the mood felt lighter. The mystery of the barn had finally been explained. Tom walked beside Ethan down the wooden steps. Well, Tom said with a small smile, looks like your curiosity helped the whole town. Ethan chuckled softly. I was just looking where someone told me not to look. Across the street, the lantern light touched the old red barn. Earlier that morning, it had seemed like the center of a strange secret. Now it was simply another building in the quiet town. The nervous woman from before approached Ethan again. You see, she said gently, I worried for nothing. Ethan tipped his hat. Sometimes questions are not a bad thing, he replied. She smiled. Dusty Creek slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm as people walked home under the starry sky. And from that day forward, the town remembered something simple but important.